Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're doing something a little different. We're putting a collection of ancient documents on the operating table, the New Testament. And look, we're not here to talk about faith. This is all about the evidence. We're going to conduct a kind of historical autopsy, looking at the cold, hard facts to see if this story actually holds up.
And really, it's a fair question to ask, right? I mean, how can you trust a story that's 2,000 years old? We don't have the originals, just copies of copies of copies. And believe me, when you start looking at the numbers, well, that's where things get really interesting.
So get this. Scholars figure there is somewhere around 400,000, that's right, 400,000 textual variants among all the surviving manuscripts. Now, what's a variant? It's just any spot where the copies don't quite match up. It could be a single letter, a changed word, or even a whole sentence.
I mean, let that sink in for a second. The entire Greek New Testament has about 140,000 words. So we have way more differences between the copies than we have words in the book itself. Your first thought has to be, well, that's a disaster. It sounds like the whole thing is just hopelessly messed up, like a massive game of telephone played over centuries.
But, and this is the crazy part, that's not the real story. In a weird twist, this huge problem, all those variants, actually points to an incredible, almost unheard of strength. See, the reason there are so many differences isn't because the text is unreliable. It's because the amount of evidence we have is just staggering.
So let's dig into that. This first line of evidence is all about the manuscript flood. We're talking about the sheer number of physical copies that have survived. This isn't a case of a couple of old, fragile scrolls. It's literally a mountain of data.
Remember that 400,000 number? Well, the reason it's so high is because we have an insane number of Greek manuscripts to compare them with. We're talking about roughly 5,700 of them. Think about it. If we only had one copy, we'd have 0 variants. But we'd also have absolutely no way of knowing if that one copy was accurate at all.
And that right there is the key. No other book from the ancient world even comes close to this. I mean, take someone like Plato. For his writings, we've got maybe a dozen manuscripts, and most of them were copied more than 1,000 years after he died. For the New Testament, thousands. And this absolute wealth of copies lets scholars cross-reference everything and piece together the original with a really, really high degree of confidence.
But it gets even better. The evidence isn't just one-dimensional, it's layered. So beyond those 5,700 Greek copies, we have something like 20,000 manuscripts of early translations into other languages like Latin, Coptic, and Syriac. And then on top of that, the early church fathers quoted the New Testament so much, we're talking over 1 million cataloged quotes, that you could pretty much reconstruct the whole thing just from their letters and sermons.
So you see, it's not a game of telephone at all, where the message gets garbled down the line. It's much more like trying to assemble a puzzle, but you have thousands of overlapping pieces. By comparing all of them, the experts can spot the mistakes, find the changes, and get a super clear picture of what the original looked like.
Okay, so that's the external evidence, and it's pretty overwhelming. But now let's move on to our second line of evidence. We're going to crack open the text itself and look for clues on the inside, these little fingerprints that can lock the story into a very specific time and a very specific place.
Okay, check this out because this is fascinating. Researchers have gone and cataloged all the most popular Jewish names from first-century Palestine, using things like burial boxes and old documents. And when you put that data up against the names you find in the Gospels and Acts, the match is just uncanny. For instance, the top 9 male names made up about 41.5% of the population back then. And in the Gospels, those same names make up 40.3% of the men. That's an incredible correlation.
Now, think about that. That's the kind of detail that would be almost impossible for a forger to get right, especially if they were writing 100 years later from, say, Rome or Egypt. You can't just guess that kind of thing. It points to a real, on-the-ground, intimate knowledge of the culture at that exact moment in time.
And it goes even deeper. There's this really subtle pattern in how the authors handle names. For the super common ones, they almost always add an identifier to avoid confusion. Simon was the #1 name, so you get Simon Peter and Simon the Zealot. Mary was also very popular, so you have Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of James. But for the rare names, like Bartholomew, no extra description needed. You just know who they're talking about.
And this is where it gets really clever. This pattern applies perfectly to the name Jesus. You might not realize it, but Jesus was actually a pretty common name back then, like the 6th or 7th most popular. That's why people in the story almost always say Jesus of Nazareth. They needed to specify which Jesus they meant. It's just like this quote suggests. Talking about Adolf in Germany in 1900 would make someone ask which Adolf.
But by 1945, not so much. This little detail suggests the stories were written before Jesus became a name that only referred to one specific person. All right, for our third and final line of evidence, we need to pull back a bit. We need to ask a really basic question. What kind of writing is this? Are we reading history or are we reading myth? So if you look at most ancient myths, from Babylon or Egypt, they pretty much all share the same basic worldview. It's this idea of continuity, where the gods, humans, and nature are all mixed together in one big cosmic system. Everything happens in endless cycles, right? The seasons, life and death, it's all a loop. But the biblical worldview was totally different. It's based on transcendence. The idea is that there's one creator who is separate from the universe, but who steps into it to act at specific, one-time moments in history.
And you can see this difference plain as day when you compare, say, the creation story in Genesis with a Babylonian myth like the Enuma Elish. Now, on the surface, some things look similar. The order of events can be kind of alike, but the worldview underneath is the complete opposite. The Babylonian story is about creation happening out of a chaotic, timeless fight between the gods. Genesis, on the other hand, describes a single, separate God creating the universe intentionally at a specific beginning point. That mindset, that history is real and linear, is the foundation for the whole Bible.
And this is such a crucial point to get. The biblical authors are not writing myths about why the seasons change or why the sun rises. They're making claims about history. They're grounding their whole belief system on specific, non-repeatable events that they say actually happened in a real place at a real time. Okay, so let's wrap this up. We've looked at the manuscript evidence, the fingerprints inside the text, and the very genre of the writing. So what's the verdict? What does this all add up to?
Well, what we have are three really strong pillars of reliability. First, we have a text that's backed up by a flood of manuscript evidence that's just unrivaled in the ancient world. Second, it's authenticated from the inside by these cultural fingerprints, like the naming patterns, that would be so hard to fake. And third, it's presented to us as history, not myth. It's a record of unique events.
And that leaves us with one final thought, a pretty provocative one. Think about it. Getting those small, mundane details right, like the popularity of names, is incredibly hard. Those are the first things people forget or get wrong. So if the authors were so careful and accurate with the little stuff, the stuff that's easy to forget, doesn't that make you wonder about the big stuff? Doesn't it lend some serious credibility to their accounts of the main, world-changing events that their story is all about?